Henry Thompson sat on a worn wooden bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The waves rolled in, steady and rhythmic, whispering secrets of time and change. Beside him sat an old, weathered suitcase, its leather cracked, its handle frayed from years of use. For decades, Henry had carried this suitcase, stuffing it with everything he thought was necessary: responsibilities, expectations, regrets, and countless what-ifs. Each year it grew heavier, yet he never questioned why he carried it or whether he even needed what was inside. Like many others, he had spent a lifetime collecting burdens, believing they were essential. But now, at 72, something had shifted. It started on his birthday when his grandson, Oliver, had asked a simple yet profound question. "Grandpa, if you could go anywhere in the world right now, where would you go?" Henry had opened his mouth to answer, but hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. Not because he lacked places he wanted to see, but because he felt anchored, held down by invisible weights. Commitments, possessions, other people's opinions, all of it had built up over time, leaving him with little room for spontaneity or joy. He had spent his younger years climbing corporate ladders, ensuring his children had everything they needed, maintaining friendships that had long lost their warmth. He had said yes when he wanted to say no, held onto objects he no longer used, and carried the fear of judgment like a stone in his pocket. Looking at the suitcase now, he wondered, what if I started unpacking? The thought was both terrifying and liberating. Life had taught him that time moves fast, yet here he was, finally realizing that he had the power to choose how he spent the years ahead. He didn't have to carry everything. He didn't have to live by the same rules. He could decide right now to let go. He reached for the suitcase and unlatched it. Inside, folded between old photographs and letters, were the invisible burdens he had carried for too long. The expectations of others. The need to prove himself. The guilt of past mistakes. The fear of aging. One by one, he imagined pulling them out, setting them free like kites into the open sky. For the first time in years, Henry felt lighter. A soft breeze touched his face, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed sand. The world stretched out before him, vast and full of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, the next chapter of his life wasn't about holding on, but about learning to let go. And so, Henry's journey began. If this story speaks to you, let's continue this journey together. Like, comment, and subscribe to Buddhist Life Philosophy for more wisdom on living a lighter, more intentional life. Every step toward letting go is a step toward true peace. Letting go of other people's opinions, Henry Thompson had spent most of his life measuring himself against the expectations of others. As a young man, he had learned early on that approval was a form of currency, one that determined how far he could go, how much he was worth, and how he was seen by the world. His father had been a stern man, believing that success meant stability, respect meant conformity, and happiness was something earned only after a lifetime of sacrifice. Henry had carried those lessons with him like an unspoken rulebook, shaping his choices around what others would think. He had taken a job that pleased his parents, married at a time that seemed appropriate, and raised his children in a way that society would nod approvingly at. Even in the smallest decisions, what car to drive, what clothes to wear, what hobbies to pursue, there was always a silent question hovering in the back of his mind. What will people say? It wasn't until his wife, Eleanor, passed away that the silence in his home forced him to confront the weight of a life spent seeking validation. He remembered standing in front of the mirror one evening, adjusting the collar of a shirt he had never liked, preparing for a dinner party he didn't want to attend. He stared at his reflection, and for the first time in years asked himself, why am I still doing this? The realization came like a slow-moving tide, washing over him with both regret and relief. He had lived according to expectations that were never truly his own. He had allowed the fear of judgment to shape him more than his own desires, and now, at 72, he wondered how much of his life had been lived for others, and how much had truly belonged to him. So he began to let go. He started small. He declined invitations to gatherings he had no interest in. He wore the clothes that made him comfortable, not the ones that made him look put together. He picked up a paintbrush for the first time in Decades, ignoring the voice that once told him art was not practical. And with each decision, the invisible weight he had carried for so long began to lift. One afternoon, as he sat by the ocean with his grandson Oliver, the boy asked, "Grandpa, what's the best thing about getting old?" Henry smiled, feeling the breeze against his face. "Not caring what anyone else thinks," he said, and for the first time in his life he truly meant it. Releasing material possessions. Henry Thompson stood in the middle of his living room, surrounded by a lifetime of accumulated things. The bookshelves were filled with novels he had promised himself he would read someday. The closets held clothes from a career he had long since retired from. The garage, he barely wanted to step inside. It was packed with forgotten furniture, tools he hadn't used in years, and boxes sealed so long ago that he no longer remembered what was inside. For decades, these possessions had felt like proof of a life well lived. They were markers of success, security, and identity. The large oak dining table had once hosted grand family dinners. The fine china in the cabinet had been saved for special occasions, occasions that had rarely come. Each item had been acquired with a sense of purpose. But now, as Henry looked around, all he saw was weight. Not physical weight, but something heavier. It was Eleanor's absence that had made him see it. After she passed, the house, once filled with warmth, had begun to feel suffocating. Every room was a museum of the past, filled with things that no longer had a purpose, only memories. He realized that he wasn't holding on to these objects because he needed them. He was holding on to them because he was afraid of what letting go might mean. One evening, he opened an old wooden chest tucked away in the attic. Inside were letters, photographs, trinkets from travels long past. He held up a small porcelain elephant Eleanor had bought in Thailand on their honeymoon. He could still hear her laughter, still remember the way she had insisted they bring home something to remember the trip. But the truth was, he didn't need the object to remember. The memories were already with him. The love, the experiences, the laughter, they weren't inside these things. They were inside him. The next morning he began the process. Some things he gave away, imagining them finding new life in another home. Some things he sold, not for the money, but for the satisfaction of knowing someone else would use them. And some things he simply let go of, understanding at last that their purpose had already been fulfilled. That night, as he sat in his newly cleared living room, a strange feeling settled over him. It wasn't loss. It was lightness. For the first time in years, he felt space, not just in his home but in his heart, saying no to unnecessary social obligations. Henry Thompson sat in his favorite chair, the soft hum of the evening settling around him. A book rested on his lap, untouched, as he stared at the invitation on the coffee table. Another dinner party, another evening of small talk and polite laughter, another night spent pretending to enjoy himself when, in truth, all he wanted was the quiet comfort of home. For most of his life, he had believed that saying yes was a duty. He had attended every family gathering, every work event, every social function that he felt was expected of him. He had smiled through conversations that left him exhausted, listened to stories he had no interest in, and nodded along to opinions he didn't share. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that declining an invitation was rude, that choosing solitude over company was selfish. But as the years passed, he began to question it. It wasn't a sudden realization, but a slow, creeping awareness that life was becoming cluttered, not just with possessions but with obligations that drained him. He thought back to a dinner party a few months ago, where he had sat at a table surrounded by people he barely knew, engaging in conversations that felt hollow. He had laughed at jokes that didn't amuse him, filled his plate with food he didn't particularly want, and left with a lingering sense of weariness. That night, as he drove home, he caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked tired, not physically, but something deeper. A kind of exhaustion that came from spending too much time in places that didn't nourish him. So when the next invitation arrived, he did something he had never done before. He said no. At first, the decision felt uncomfortable, like breaking an unspoken rule. But then, as the evening unfolded, something surprising happened. He didn't feel guilty. He felt free. Instead of making small talk, he sat on his porch watching the sky shift from gold to deep indigo. Instead of forcing conversation, he listened to the soft rustling of the trees. Instead of pretending, he simply existed, and it was enough. He realized then that time was too precious to be spent on obligations that brought no joy. It was okay to choose stillness over noise, depth over surface, solitude over social expectation, and in doing so, he wasn't closing himself off from the world. He was simply making space for the parts of it that truly mattered, embracing natural beauty. Henry Thompson stood in front of the mirror, running a hand through his silver hair. The bathroom light cast soft shadows across his face, tracing the deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He leaned in closer, studying. The wrinkles etched into his skin, the slight sagging at his jawline, the age spots that had appeared over the years. He had spent most of his life without thinking much about his appearance, but lately he had noticed how the world around him spoke about aging, on television, in magazines, in whispered conversations at the barber shop. There was always talk of fighting age, hiding it, reversing it, creams, surgeries, hair dyes, workouts meant to defy the natural course of time. He had seen friends desperately try to hold on to youth, avoiding mirrors, avoiding birthdays, avoiding any reminder that they were growing older. And for a moment he understood. He too had once looked at his reflection and thought, where did the younger version of me go? But as he stood there now, something shifted. He reached up and traced one of the lines on his forehead with his finger. That one had come from years of deep thought, from late nights working, from the weight of responsibilities. The ones at the corners of his mouth? Those had been carved by laughter, by shared moments of joy with Eleanor, by years of smiling at his children as they grew. Every grey hair held a memory. Every crease told a story. He remembered his grandson, Oliver, once asking why old people had so many lines on their faces. Henry had laughed and told him, because we've lived long enough to earn them. Now as he looked at himself he realized how deeply true that was. His face was not something to be hidden or changed. It was a map of his life, a testament to every experience, every love, every hardship he had survived. Stepping back from the mirror, he felt something he hadn't expected. Pride. Not in the way he looked, but in the life that had brought him here. He no longer wished to erase time. He wanted to embrace it, to wear it as a badge of honor. After all, growing older wasn't something to fear, it was a privilege. Re-evaluating activities, keeping only what truly matters. Henry Thompson sat on his back porch, staring at the neatly trimmed hedges lining his yard. Every Saturday for the past 40 years, he had spent hours tending to them, clipping each branch with precision, making sure they were just the right shape. It had started as a simple chore, then became a habit, and eventually a rule he never questioned. The hedges had to be perfect. That was just the way it had always been. But now, as he looked at them, he felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction, just exhaustion. He had spent so much of his life following routines that no longer served him. Every morning he still read the newspaper cover to cover, though the news often left him feeling frustrated rather than informed. He still kept up with certain hobbies, not because they brought him joy, but because he had done them for so long that stopping felt strange. Even his golf games, once a source of excitement, now felt like an obligation, another appointment on his calendar, rather than something he truly wanted to do. It wasn't until his grandson, Oliver, visited one afternoon that Henry saw things differently. The boy had run into the yard, picking up a fallen branch and twirling it like a sword. "Grandpa," he had laughed, "why do you spend so much time on these bushes? They just grow back anyway." Henry had chuckled, but that night his grandson's words lingered. Why did he? Why did he hold on to routines that felt more like burdens than pleasures? Was it because they once mattered, or simply because he was afraid of what would happen if he let them go? The next morning, Henry made a decision. He put down the shears. Instead of pruning the hedges, he sat in the shade with a book he had been meaning to read for years. Instead of forcing himself through his usual morning routine, he let himself wake up slowly, enjoying the simple act of watching the sunrise. He stopped saying yes to activities out of habit and started asking himself a new question. Does this bring me joy? Some things stayed. The long walks by the ocean, the evenings spent painting. Others, like the endless maintenance of a perfect yard, he let go. For the first time in years, his days no longer felt scheduled but chosen, and that, he realized, made all the difference. Cutting toxic relationships. Henry Thompson sat on his porch, a warm cup of coffee cradled in his hands. The morning air was crisp, the sky streaked with soft hues of pink and gold. It was the kind of peaceful moment he had come to cherish. Quiet, simple, unburdened. But even as he sat there, his phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him back into a familiar weight. He already knew who it was before he even glanced at the screen. Richard. They had been friends for over 40 years, or at least that's what Henry had always told himself. Their friendship had started in their early careers, built on shared ambitions and late-night conversations over whiskey. But somewhere along the way, the relationship had turned into something else, something exhausting. Richard was the kind of man who never called to ask how Henry was doing, only to unload his latest frustrations. Every conversation was a monologue of complaints, about work, about family, about the world in general. He rarely listened, and when he did, it was only to dismiss or criticize. For years, Henry had tolerated it. He had convinced himself that this was just how Richard was, that friendships meant taking the good with the bad. He had listened patiently through years of negativity, excused the selfishness, ignored the way he always felt drained after their conversations. But lately, something had changed. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the realization that time was too precious to spend on relationships that felt more like obligations. Maybe it was the simple truth that life was meant to be shared with people who lifted you up, not those who weighed you down. So, that morning, as the phone buzzed again, Henry made a decision. He let it ring. He didn't need to explain, didn't need to argue, didn't need to feel guilty. He simply chose peace. He took a slow sip of coffee, watching as the sun rose higher in the sky, and for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. He had spent too many years holding on to relationships that no longer served him, out of habit, out of history, out of fear of letting go. But now he understood. Some people are meant to be in your life for a season, not a lifetime. And when their time has passed, it's okay to walk away. Stopping comparisons. Henry Thompson sat on a park bench, watching as two men his age passed by, deep in conversation. One of them, dressed in a crisp golf shirt, spoke with enthusiasm about his recent trip to Europe. The other, wearing an expensive watch, nodded, mentioning his investment portfolio and how well his retirement funds were performing. Henry smiled politely as they passed, but deep inside, an old, familiar feeling stirred. It was a feeling he had carried for years, even when he thought he had outgrown it. The quiet voice that whispered, "Have I done enough? Have I lived well enough?" For most of his life, he had measured himself against others. He had watched colleagues climb higher on the corporate ladder, seen friends buy bigger houses, heard about neighbors taking extravagant vacations. He had spent too many nights lying awake, wondering if he had made the right choices, if he should have worked harder, saved more, done more. Even now at 72, that voice still tried to creep in. But then he thought of Eleanor. She had always known how to silence that voice. She used to say, "Happiness isn't a race, Henry, it's a walk. If you're too busy looking at someone else's path, you'll trip over your own." He could still hear her laughter, the way she would take his hand, and pull him away from his own self-doubt. He glanced down at his own hands, now lined with age, and realized something. Those men passing by, they had their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of doubt that he would never see. Comparison was an illusion, a trick of the mind that made it seem as though everyone else had figured out something he hadn't. But the truth was, no one's life was perfect. No one's journey was the same. He took a deep breath, looking at the trees swaying gently in the afternoon light. The leaves didn't compete with one another to be the greenest, the tallest, the most vibrant. They simply existed, each in its own time, each in its own way. Henry stood up, feeling the weight of comparison begin to lift. He had spent too many years looking at what others had, what others had done. But today, he chose to walk his own path, at his own pace, in his own way, and for the first time in a long time that was enough. Redefining goals, Henry Thompson sat on his back porch, a cup of tea warming his hands, as the afternoon sun stretched long golden streaks across the yard. He had always thought retirement would bring a sense of completion, that after decades of work and responsibility, he would finally feel like he had arrived. But now at 72, he found himself questioning what that even meant. For most of his life, success had been a moving target, one he chased relentlessly. In his 30s, it was about career advancement. In his 40s, it was providing a comfortable life for his family. In his 50s, it was about securing enough money to retire without worry. He had spent years setting goals, reaching them, and immediately replacing them with new ones. It was as if he believed life was a checklist, and the more boxes he ticked, the more fulfilled he would become. But something had changed. The promotions, the financial milestones, the recognition, they had all mattered once, but now they felt distant, almost irrelevant. He no longer needed to prove anything. The question that once fueled his ambitions, what's next, no longer seemed to apply. The life ahead of him wasn't about climbing higher or achieving more. It was about something simpler, something deeper. He thought of his grandson, Oliver, who had spent an entire afternoon last week trying to teach him how to skip stones across the lake. They had laughed until their stomachs ached when Henry's attempts failed miserably. It wasn't a big accomplishment. It wasn't something that could be measured or added to a resume. But it had been one of the happiest moments he had felt in a long time. Maybe success wasn't about goals at all. Maybe it was about presence, about waking up each morning and choosing joy, choosing peace, choosing the things that truly mattered. He set down his cup of tea and smiled to himself. There were no more ladders to climb, no more races to run. The only thing left to do was live, not with urgency, but with intention, and for the first time, he felt like he had finally arrived. Prioritizing your own happiness, Henry Thompson had spent most of his life putting others first. It had always seemed like the right thing to do. He had been a devoted husband, a reliable father, a hard-working employee, a loyal friend. He had shown up when he was needed, offered a helping hand, sacrificed his own desires for the sake of those he loved. And for a long time he believed that was what life was about. Giving, serving, fulfilling roles that others depended on. But now, at 72, in the quiet of his days, he found himself wondering. When had he last asked himself what truly made him happy? He thought back to Eleanor, his late wife, who had always been the first to remind him to slow down. "One day, Henry," she had said, "you're going to realize that happiness isn't something you earn by taking care of everyone else. It's something you choose for yourself." He had smiled at her words back then, kissed her forehead, and gone right back to tending to everyone else. It wasn't until after she was gone that he began to understand what she meant. He had spent decades ensuring the happiness of others. Yet now, in this later stage of life, he realized he had never truly made space for his own. He had always placed it second, always treated it as something he would get to eventually. But when? And at what cost? One morning, Henry made a decision. He would start choosing himself, not in a selfish way, but in a way that honored the years he had left. He would wake up early to watch the sunrise, not because he had somewhere to be, but because he wanted to. He would take long walks by the ocean, let the waves wash over his feet, feel the sun on his skin. He would paint again, not for approval or perfection, but for the sheer joy of it. Most importantly, he would stop feeling guilty for prioritizing himself. He had spent a lifetime giving to others, and now it was time to give something to himself. Peace, fulfillment, happiness. As he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, he felt something he hadn't in years. A quiet, steady contentment. He finally understood what Eleanor had meant. Happiness wasn't waiting for him at the end of duty and sacrifice. It had been here all along, simply waiting for him to choose it. And now he finally had. The freedom of letting go. Henry Thompson stood by the ocean, watching the waves roll in and out, steady and unhurried. The sky above stretched wide and endless, a soft gradient of fading gold and deepening blue. There was something about the vastness of it all that made him feel light, as if the weight he had carried for years had finally begun to dissolve into the breeze. He thought back to the man he had been, always striving, always carrying, always holding on to things he thought defined him. The opinions of others had shaped too many of his choices. His possessions had cluttered not just his home, but his heart. Obligations had filled his days with noise, leaving little room for what truly mattered. He had compared himself to others, measured his worth against moving targets, convinced himself that success had to look a certain way. And for too long he had neglected the simplest truth, that his own happiness was just as important as everyone else's. But here, in the gentle rhythm of the waves, he understood something he had missed for years. Life was never about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go, letting go of the need to please everyone, letting go of the possessions that no longer served him, letting go of the guilt that came with choosing himself, letting go of the idea that happiness was something to chase, rather than something to embrace in the present moment. And in that letting go, he had found something he never expected: freedom. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, one he had picked up earlier that morning. Turning it over in his fingers, he thought about everything it represented: the burdens he had carried, the expectations he had lived by, the weight of a life spent trying to be everything for everyone. Then, with a quiet smile, he tossed the stone into the water, watching as it disappeared beneath the surface. He didn't need it anymore. As he turned to leave, Henry felt something different in his step, not just lightness, but peace. He had finally stepped into the life that had been waiting for him all along, the one not shaped by obligation, but by intention. A life where every moment was his own to choose. And so, his journey continued. Not toward more, but toward less. Not toward proving himself, but toward simply being, and perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Life is too short to carry unnecessary weight, too precious to live according to someone else's rules. Wherever you are in your journey, know that it's never too late to let go, to choose lightness over burden, presence over expectation, joy over approval. If this story has resonated with you, I invite you to continue this journey with us. Like, comment, and subscribe to Buddhist Life Philosophy for more reflections on living simply, intentionally, and with an open heart. The path to peace begins with a single step, and sometimes that step is simply choosing to let go.